area of the trade hall. All right, nice. Looks like we are right at 1/4 after the hour, so I think we'll go ahead and jump in. So great. Thanks everybody for stopping in this morning. For Aubrey and I, we're in Denver, Colorado, and you know, afternoon, evening, maybe Friday for some people, depending on where you're at. We're excited to be here at DrupalCon Global, talking to everybody about admin UX. So let's jump right into it. You can see we're both sharing our screens. You'll probably want to double click Aubrey's screen share because she's going to have the actual deck. I am going to just keep up a persistent version of the slide we're looking at right now so that everyone always has access to a bit.ly link to our slide deck. And then we've got the hop-in short link to our booth up there. And we'll be in our booth after the session, like happy to answer questions, just talk generally, like get into the weeds what anybody's interested in. So a little bit about us. I'm Nick Schweitzer. I'm the development director at Elevated Third on Drupal.org. I am Schweitzer in. I've been at Elevated Third for a little over 10 years now. Been working in Drupal a little bit longer than that, since Drupal 5. So remember the good old days. And yeah, I'm excited to talk a little more with you all today.
And I'm Aubrey Hill. I'm a senior developer at Elevated Third. I've been working in Drupal for a little over nine-ish years. I've been at Elevated Third for about three and a half. You can find me on Drupal.org at A3Hill. So not quite as long as Nick. I remember the Drupal 7 days, but a lot of experience between us, and then also with the rest of our team that we glean experience from. So just a little bit about our agency so you kind of know where that experience comes. Elevated Third has been working solely in Drupal for about 12 years now. So we've really honed in on the Drupal side of things and building lots of different websites for all of our clients.
All right. So let's get into it. I mentioned earlier before, I think everybody popped in, just kind of a general outline of the session. I'll do that again, just so everyone knows what to expect. I'm going to spend the first like 20 minutes or so talking about planning considerations and kind of high level, more like discovery type stuff. But don't bail if that gets boring, because I will pass it over to Aubrey about halfway through, and she'll really get into the weeds of how we're actually implementing all of this stuff. With core tools, contrib tools, and then also some custom stuff. And like I mentioned before, like all stuff we're happy to talk about, answer questions if we have time at the end of the session, but also we'll pop over to our booth for an hour after this, and you know, we're happy to like get into the weeds with anybody who's interested. So to jump right in, I want to start by just talking about like why we're here and why we put this session together in the first place. And you know, I tried to distill that down into as concise a statement as I can. And you know, it's because we really believe that a complex digital platform requires a well-architected and practical admin experience. In the past 5 years or so, Drupal's really moved into a space where a great admin experience is vital, just because, you know, Drupal 8, Drupal 9 now are really operating at an enterprise scale where every inefficiency can become a really major roadblock. And if you wait until admin issues are really like causing tangible problems for admins, it might already be too late, because there's so much irreversible like technical debt created by architecture decisions that you made really early on in the process. So that's why we want to start at the beginning, because the best way to avoid long-term issues caused by a poor admin user experience is to consider it from day one of your project. So not the day you start building, but like the day you start talking about the site. So like I mentioned, we'll talk planning first. And, you know, we really believe that building a consistent, delightful admin user experience on the fly is impossible if you haven't laid groundwork for what that's actually going to look like. So if you spend the time up front to understand your users, understand their needs, and then think about how those fit into the larger system you're creating, it's always going to be time well spent. So starting with like, get to know your users. You want to start the planning process by thinking about who's actually going to be administering your site and what their priority tasks will look like. As devs and site builders, it's easy to forget all the different paths that an admin could potentially take through the site, and all the different ways that they might get overwhelmed by default Drupal conventions that, you know, for us are things we see every day. So it's just like not a big deal, or things you put out of your mind. So to avoid that, we want to put ourselves in the shoes of real people who are maintaining the site and think through how we can give them enough focus to get their work done without being completely overwhelmed by system configuration and other intimidating, maybe insecure access that is ultimately not necessary. So going a little deeper into considering our admins, we're in the planning stage. We've decided admin UX is a priority. Like, we want to start by asking a few questions to help align roles, permissions, and overall experience with the tasks admins need to accomplish. So we'll dig into these a bit more, but just a high-level summary. Like, first, think about how technical are your users. Like, are they technical enough to understand the consequences of accidentally disabling a solar index or mass deleting a bunch of users? Maybe they're just technical enough to be dangerous, or maybe they're a first-time Drupal user whose day job isn't related to the internet or computers at all. Second, how much control do they actually need? Like, with need really being the operative word. And then finally, how much control do they want? Aligning this with the needs and skill sets of users can be a challenge, but it's really a great starting point in determining what your permissions and roles and the overall structure are going to look like. All right, so first let's dig into how technical are your admins. Technical expertise shouldn't necessarily be the determining factor in deciding whether a specific person is granted a specific role, but it can be a really helpful guide in deciding how far to go with things like help text, documentation, and then eventually where you might have to cut some corners when budget starts to get tight, because at the end of the day, budgets are a reality. Like, we all work in finite situations, or most of us do. And in many situations, there's likely going to be a clear divide between roles that's based around more and less technical tasks. A lot of times that takes the form of configuration versus content roles. So, for example, it's possible, but not entirely likely, that the same person on your site is going to be updating marketing landing pages and configuring CDN purgers. So that's a good time to take the opportunity to simplify just across the board and delegate those to different roles, that if you need to assign those roles to the same person, you can still do that. And then finally, a user's technical expertise isn't necessarily a license to slack on documentation. Well-written help text and user guides based around specific tasks will be valuable for just about any end user working on the site, because odds are you're building for someone with less Drupal experience than yourself that might need that additional context. All right, so next, let's talk about the control they need. This is important because it allows us to put priority tasks front and center. We don't want to bog our users down with a bunch of extra menus and functionality when all they're trying to do is just publish a new landing page or maybe add a new variation to a single personalized block. And this is also super important from a security standpoint. The principle of least privilege is always a really good idea and something we always try to consider in this. And you want to take the time to think about how that applies to the set of users that'll be accessing your site. And you want to be sure the roles that you decide on support that. And Drupal does a really good job of enabling that, because it gives you a pretty granular way to break out permissions even without like customizing that at all. All right, and then last question about users: how much control do they want? Like I mentioned earlier, it's important to balance this with the need question, because depending on your user's experience and comfort level, some might be really reluctant and want less control than they actually need, just because they want to minimize their chances of harming the site. While, I'm sure everyone's encountered these, you have your other users who just want to jump in and tweak and tweak and tweak and figure out how everything works, and their intentions are good, but they don't always fully understand the risk of doing that in a production environment. So, we found that staging environments can be a really good supplemental piece in helping ease the tension there, because you can give users on both sides what they want. You can give a reluctant user a place to learn a system in a low-risk scenario, and you can give your overzealous user a place to play, learn, and break things without actually affecting the production site. And then along those same lines, you want to make sure you're taking the time to align what your admins want with the actual requirements of their role. So it's easy to get caught up in the details and lose track of the full scope of tasks. While you're doing it, you want to take the time to consider what the overall experience each role will actually expect is going to look like. So a general site-wide admin with a broader set of tasks will likely appreciate a more open-ended experience that allows them flexibility and kind of the ability to do whatever they want. While users, maybe the less experienced users that we talked about earlier, they're going to really prefer a more specific and shorter task list, and they're going to want curated tasks and like a dashboard or something that helps them get right where they want with minimal friction so they can just be in and out. All right, so we talked about users a little bit. Let's move on and talk a little bit more about architecture. So we're going to dig into this a little bit more, and we're going to really focus here on how the content structure and module decisions that you make are going to affect the admin experience. And again, like I mentioned, Aubrey will dig a lot more into implementation stuff in a few. First category that we want to jump into here is unstructured content. So a term I would guess most people are familiar with, but I'll dig into this a little bit more just to make sure we're all on the same page here. So, you know, we find that unstructured content tends to be like a really common thing for us these days. And it can be implemented in a lot of different ways. But at the heart of the idea of unstructured content is the fact that there's no single way that this content always needs to be rendered on the site. And on top of that, there's probably not a lot of metadata that's really important to have fully defined for each instance of this content, because you're not going to be doing things like, you know, aggregating it or building views or querying for it in unique ways or filtering like based on the fields attached to it. And then that's a pretty general assumption, but tends to prove true for us with unstructured content. So that obviously introduces a lot of variation into the way the content can be structured, built, and administered. And, you know, I think, you know, I'm sure there's some debate about this, but I really think the leading ways to manage unstructured content in Drupal are Layout Builder and Paragraphs. You know, there's of course like the core block system and some other tools, but those seem like the big ones. And those do result in pretty substantially different admin experiences. But, you know, those two and a lot of the others are going to have pretty similar considerations when you're looking at them in the planning process. So both Layout Builder and Paragraphs are really fundamentally based on a system of components that can be combined in different ways to produce a huge variety of layouts. In both cases, the scope of what a component can do has a really big impact on the admin experience. So for example, an overly complicated component can create a really confusing and overwhelming experience when there are just like tons of fields and stuff that you don't always want to use. And a ton of smaller, really specific components can also be really confusing because it's going to make it a lot harder for admins to remember what each one does and how to like combine them properly to actually do what they want to do. And, you know, unfortunately, there's not a single rule of thumb that we can really just sum up concisely in a single sentence and say like, do this thing to make sure your components always strike this balance. But I think just, you know, the fact that we're talking about this in the planning process and thinking about it and how people are actually interacting with these things is going to go a long way. All right, so next, jumping into structured content. Excuse me. Drupal's done this well for a really long time, but it doesn't mean we should ignore it as part of the admin experience. And I think this is where, you know, Aubrey's going to have some great tools to talk about in a little bit with like how we actually implement this stuff to make the admin experience just simpler, more focused, more refined, especially for complicated structured content. But for now, we're going to focus on the planning phase and just two quick points that I want to call attention to. First being each field should be focused on doing one job and doing it well. So 5 simple to understand fields are always better than one really complicated field, you know, which I mean, that probably sounds familiar from the component stuff that I mentioned earlier, like really similar concepts. And even when your fields are simple, you want to make sure you're giving them clear, purpose-focused names and providing useful help text. Second, you want to make sure you're using the right field for the job. So, you know, a structured node with 3 plain text fields is much less useful than a node with a name, email, and phone number field, each added as their proper field type. Because then, you know, we're talking about structured content. This is the stuff that we're going to be, you know, building views, filtering, querying for. So you have like the right programmatic foundation in place to be able to interact with that stuff. All right, and so next, just like a real quick graphic comparing those two. I'll kind of rush through this, but again, like we've got our deck up. So check it out in more detail, ask questions if you have them. Left is just kind of a basic wireframe example of a structured page. Right is a basic example of an unstructured page. You can kind of see how those components fit together on the unstructured and how there are some like more defined fields. Looks more sort of like a blog post style thing on the structured page. All right, so Next up, let's move a little bit more away from content structure and talk about naming conventions. So these are important with both structured and unstructured content. Excuse me, grab a drink of water here real quick. I'm kind of coughing. In the case of unstructured content, you're likely building a component system, and naming conventions within that system are going to be really important to consider early on, because those elements are going to be used in a lot of different places on the site in different combinations. So regardless of the actual names that you land on, you want to make sure you're being consistent kind of with the higher level vernacular, I guess, for lack of a better word, around how your design system is going to work. So don't call them elements in one place, components in another, and atoms in yet another place. Like, have consistent language around how you talk about like what those bigger pieces are. But then more specifically, when you're naming individual components, try to leave your developer brain at the door and use conventions that make sense to marketers and the content admins that will actually be using the site. So these users will almost always connect more with the business need of a component, not the technical function. So, for example, names like billboard and lead in are probably going to do a better job describing the actual purpose of components than generic names like banner or basic copy. And finally, don't forget to add descriptions to your components, because they're not always front and center, but whether they're custom blocks or paragraphs or any nice like built-in Drupal place that admins can go and remember like what the purpose of that specific thing is. And then in the case of structured content, it does tend to be a little bit more straightforward when it comes to naming conventions, just because fields and content types often have clearer purposes associated with them. But that doesn't mean it should be an afterthought. Like, again, in this case, it's important to focus naming conventions on the job the field's performing and to make that name as specific as possible. So two separate fields that are used for shipping address and billing address can be a really good example of this. Like, technically, they're pretty much the same thing. But if users, admins, or custom code gets those backwards, the results can be confusing at best and completely business disrupting at worst. All right, next chunk is WYSIWYG. With the trend toward the more opinionated component-based design systems, like focused a lot on structured content, like WYSIWYG editors tend to be a less prominent part of a Drupal site, but they can still be a really useful tool for site administrators if you take the time to configure them right. So in general, we like to limit the need for a WYSIWYG editor. And we do this by building focused, purpose-driven content types, like kind of what we've already talked about up to this point. But that does make it so that in the instances where WYSIWYG is necessary, it can be a lot less intimidating, and it'll enable admins to actually make progress rather than impede it by forcing them to like try and build a table with WYSIWYG buttons and like put colors in there and stuff like that. So in the circumstances where it is required, take the time to make sure everything included works as advertised. And kind of an oft forgotten part of this is text formats. So like if you're including buttons that add markup only to have it stripped by the active text format, you'll end up with some pretty frustrated admins. And that's a piece Aubrey's going to touch on later too, with some nice ways to mitigate that and control it a little bit. But point being that thoughtful CK editor configuration does go a long way. And a few buttons that work correctly are going to be a lot more useful than the default configuration with like 25 buttons that maybe kind of work sometimes. So to take it a step further, you can also use tools like Media Library and Linkit to better integrate the WYSIWYG editing experience with the rest of the site, so it doesn't kind of feel like this disparate thing where you're forcing users to upload one-off images like directly into the file directory, or guess at link paths and then sometimes put in absolute, sometimes put in relative paths. And again, two that Aubrey's going to touch on in more detail later, so we can talk a little bit about how those like actually help and what they do. All right, so last piece of my section, and then we'll get to the nitty gritty. Let's talk about what we call the build spec. So we've talked about a lot of different considerations like through planning in the abstract up to this point, like a lot of interesting ideas and concepts. And they're good to think through and be aware of, but they're not nearly as useful as if you actually put them into practice as part of a more formalized planning process. So at Elevated Third, we use a doc based in Google Sheets to define all of like the naming conventions, for content types, components, media entities, taxonomies, you name it, all the stuff that's structured in Drupal goes in this doc. And it works great for us, but it's not necessarily the single best way to approach the planning process. With the main point being, don't start the build in Drupal. Use a document that's easy to change that'll allow you to flesh out the site structure, relationships, naming conventions, all of that early on, with a lot of opportunities to change things easily. If you just start building in Drupal with a general idea, you're almost definitely going to end up with issues like mismatched human readable and machine names for fields that are going to make your site a total nightmare to maintain long term. So let's get a little more into the details of what's considered in this planning document. And again, like the screenshot here and the slide is our version of the document that we call a build spec. We borrowed this from something Palantir posted publicly like years ago, and it's worked great for us in the time since. We've kind of like adapted it to fit what we've been doing. But really, we recommend going as deep as time will allow, like thinking through as many details as possible. And that's things like field names, help texts, whether a field is required, specifically what values the field accepts. Like that's all easy to do when you're in this higher level planning headspace that allows you to focus on the larger web of site-wide conventions that you're actually creating. You're not kind of in like developer tunnel vision, I just need to get this thing working mode. And on top of that, it allows you to include a larger team in the build process to make your project more efficient, and also make sure junior team members and team members with less project context can follow the system that you've created without needing to fully understand every single detail. And you know, as a project leader, architect, or whatever role might be doing this, also doesn't stick you with doing like every single bit of site building because you're the only one who understands the system, which is a win for everybody. And finally, one last point about the build spec, or you know, whatever your planning document is. Like I mentioned this earlier on, but I really do want to stress that the format matters a lot less than the practice of actually just doing this planning. The spreadsheet format works great for us. Like, I'm not here to tell you, like, do it exactly that way. You know, we've experimented with UML, InVision's freehand tool, and, you know, I'm sure there are a ton more that I don't even know about out there that people are probably using in really interesting ways. Like, the point that I want to make and stress is that the entire goal of this process is to build out, change, tweak, and understand the site architecture in a format that's a lot more easily mutable than like just creating fields in Drupal, because that takes time to build fields, export config, push, import config over and over and over as you keep like screwing up your naming conventions. All right, and so we've talked quite a bit about planning. We've talked about site architecture, we've talked about admin roles, and you know, just the time that we're taking to set ourselves up to build something that's well architected and easy to use. So now we'll jump more into the implementation side. So I'll pass it off to Aubrey to talk about how we actually make these things a reality.
Yeah, and so like Nick said, you know, we've gotten to know our admin users, we've created that plan, and now it's really time to implement it. So we're going to talk through some core and contrib modules that we like to use on a regular basis to improve the admin experience, as well as some customizations that we make here and there to really plus up that experience. So, you know, the first place to always start is with core. You know, right out of the box, Drupal 8 and 9 come packaged with tools that help us improve the admin experience. And that list is growing all the time. You know, we even heard a couple of days ago during the Dries note that admin experience is really a focus. You know, and so I'm sure we'll be seeing much more come into there. So core is always a great place to start. And one of those, you know, that we mentioned was Claro. This has been one of the latest, you know, and most visibly noticeable admin changes to Drupal here recently. Claro, the new admin theme, really gives a clean, modern feel, you know, and it's accessible for our admins, which is great. And while it's still experimental, it's been really working great for us. We really haven't run into the issues. And we find, you know, a lot of our site admins that have been in Drupal for years have really enjoyed the new look and feel. Just clean, they feel like they can find what they're looking for pretty easily. Additionally, you know, Nick mentioned media and media library earlier. These are huge upgrades from admin, kind of from where we have been. It's really useful in reusing your media, finding it, all of that kind of stuff, you know, and core comes packaged with all of the standard media types that you'd expect, you know, the images, files, and videos just by installing it, but you can always extend that to give your users even more media types as you see fit for your specific use case. And the The media library, is a great little field widget that we can use to give users that browsable, searchable modal just to find the right media asset quickly and easily. Layout Builder, as I'm sure all of you know, probably attended a few sessions here about Layout Builder. It's this really great visual editing experience that our users really want. And so they can understand when they're building those unstructured pages, how the page is actually going to look without editing a field, saving, editing a field, saving. They can really get a good sense of what the page is going to come together like by using that. You can create your own custom layouts to fit your needs and designs. No more are our site admins trying to shoehorn content always into fields and things that may not work, or rearrange orders of things. Layout Builder really brings that home. And then this, it's been around for a long time, but the custom blocks, being able to use those inside of Layout Builder, and as Nick mentioned earlier too, you can really make these components as flexible as you need for your designs, or lock them down as much as required based on your user's technical needs. And you can even make them flexible enough that as they change what type of layout or region they're in, they can shift styles slightly. So you don't have to build, 50 components to make the site really, really extendable and flexible. You can kind of tweak and change those as you go. So that's kind of it for core. But the community also provides a ton of stuff, and they really take it a step further. And again, the community is always improving the admin experience too, and there's just a ton of contrib modules out there that focus just on improving the admin experience. As we go through these slides, like Nick mentioned, our slides are linked there in that bit.ly, but each one will have a link to the project page for these slides, so they should be easy for you guys to find. We're going to start with paragraph browsers. When using paragraph entities, you can sort your paragraphs into categories. And additionally, in addition to those great names that Nick discussed earlier, we can provide screenshots. The picture says 1,000 words. Users know exactly what it's going to look like. Maybe know that I need an image, I need an icon, I need a video, I need this much text. It's just a great way that they can visualize the content they're creating before they click the button. Another one, field group, just like the name says, you can group fields accordingly to help admins find what they want quickly and easily. Instead of presenting all the fields on one page, it does add an extra click, but it lets people know right where the fields are. They can find them easily. And like Nick mentioned earlier as well, using names to name these sections can help users align with their business needs and not just the technical needs of building that page. Kind of back into Layout Builder, Layout Builder modal here brings that editing experience out of the sidebar and drawer into the modal, just giving a little bit more workspace for our admins to see what they're editing, to move things around. This can be kind of a personal preference, depending on what your users need. We find that we use it a lot. It really comes in handy. And when you're using that Layout Builder modal, you add the media library, on top of that. And because we're using the front end theme for our Layout Builder pages, the media library theme takes that on as well. And this little module here just resets the theme. Right now, it resets it back to the 7 theme, but Claro, there's an issue for Claro in the works. And so what this really does is just gives your admins a more consistent experience across the site. And we get lots of, just the buttons are the same, that kind of stuff. Layout Builder, similar to paragraph browsers, Layout Builder lets you quickly categorize and give icons to all of your components that you've created. And again, that just quick visual cue can give your admins an idea about the content that they're creating. And then, we've talked about that principle of, backing off and not giving them access to everything and only giving them access to what they need. Layout Builder restrictions is a great module to help you do that. It allows, the components, us to limit the components that are being used per content type. You can also limit which layouts are available per content type. Maybe you want 1, 2, 3, and 4 columns for, content type A, but content type B only really needs the 1 and 3 column stuff. So it gives you a little more flexibility and restriction there. And kind of diving into the WYSIWYG editor, Entity Embed and Entity Browser are great modules that you can use to embed other entities into your fields. We find that we're using these a lot when we have blogs or articles, and you need, in the middle of it, you need to feature some other piece of content, so maybe just a little teaser snippet, and so by using these, you can allow your users to embed any sort of entity in addition to what media library does as its button, getting the media in there. But this would let you reference other nodes. Nick mentioned earlier too, link it, that giving that autocomplete field when creating links, linking directly to the node, it makes it consistent so we don't have absolute and relative URLs all mixed together. Just a really consistent kind of experience when they're bouncing back and forth between WYSIWYG and kind of that fielded content. Another one of my favorites for the WYSIWYG formats is this allowed formats module that allows you to limit which formats are available per field. And so, some fields, maybe we only need to allow bold and italics. Other fields need bold, italics, lists, links, media, all sorts of stuff. And this really allows us to make a couple WYSIWYG formats and limit those texts accordingly to what the designs, what we think the user needs. Really extendable, really easy to configure for a big win. Same with this one, CK editor height. That visual side that we keep talking about, when people see a big text space, they feel like they have to fill it. So when it's a blog or an article or, long text format, having, 10 to 15 lines is great. But when it's a smaller text size or space that you want text for, having, 2 or 3 lines can just visually cue in the admin of how much text they should be writing without the need to limit that to make sure that it looks good. And then the last one of our contrib modules is chosen. Sometimes we get these really long taxonomy lists, and being able to put them into like a searchable dropdown can really make it easier for the admins to find the term that they're looking for instead of scrolling through hundreds or items depending on what your site needs. And so then moving into kind of the personal touch, after you've exhausted what core and the community modules have available, sometimes you need to take things a step further depending on, again, your user base, like what their needs are. And you can really plus up the experience by adding just some small CSS and JavaScript changes. Just a few that we add to the majority of our sites is, we really adapt the way that paragraphs are draggable. Sometimes we have a lot of paragraph fields, in a single field, or paragraph entities in a single field, and to be able to drag those and reorder them can sometimes be a challenge. And so we like to add DRAGGABLE.js here for doing that. It's just kind of a quick little JavaScript library that we add in, and then making that reordering much simpler. We also make a few little tweaks to the layout builder modal, just again trying to keep that editing experience more consistent for your users, just making sure that the buttons are the same. Sometimes we even like to make the URL field here, like you see in the screenshot, have the text or the link text side by side instead of stacked, just trying to preserve some vertical real estate space on the page. Another one that we do is we like to edit the little paragraph buttons, again, preserving that screen real estate as best we can, but still making these buttons really clear and understandable to the users, just trying to make them a little bit smaller. And along those lines of making things smaller, we also like to collapse our paragraphs. So like in the second paragraph you see here where it starts to kind of fade, you can click on this paragraph and expand it and see all of its kind of previewed content without actually clicking in to edit it. But then when we have, 10, 15, however many paragraphs the client has decided to add, or user rather, they're just a little shorter. They can drag them around, but still get a good idea of what this paragraph represents. So that really helps there. And lastly, we do make a few little kind of our structured pages note for the node page theming. We like to make the action buttons, so like the save, the preview, content moderation, just kind of in a sticky footer, so you don't have to scroll the whole page. If you get into a really long page, that's kind of just a nice handy thing if they're just hopping in to make one quick edit. Just a nice little thing. And then just one little tidbit here, we maintain a distribution called Paragon, and ADMINKit is a piece of that, where all of these customations that we just talked about are included there. It's up on Drupal.org if anybody wants to try it. Submit us issues if you find things aren't working or have other ideas for us to improve. And a lot of this has just come from the experience of our team and just listening to our users and getting feedback and just trying to make that repeatable, so we're not starting from scratch all the time.
All right, and I wanted to call out real quick. I love the chat. Seeing all the real-time conversation is super cool, and I've been keeping track of stuff. And Luca, I did see your question. It looks like the ADMINKit mention probably helped, but we'll finish up just a couple more slides here, and then we can circle back to that. And I've got like a few other things that I was keeping an eye on in the chat that we'll cover as well. So yeah, just to run through like a few more pieces, like after you've actually built it, like you've got this nice, like fancy, well-architected admin UI, like make sure you actually test it, because there's going to be, a lot of people using it. So we'll talk a little bit about QA and testing, which the big things here is like you want to actually test this as real users. And, I say you, that's sort of bare minimum in my mind. Like in the best case scenario, you're going to have the people actually working with the site doing this testing, and you're going to be running through common tasks for each role to make sure those things are all doable and get done as expected, and that you're actually logging in as users with the proper roles delegated to them. Because it's easy to always succumb to the temptation of just like log in as root and test. Okay, yeah, it's good. Let's keep going. But when you're putting this much attention into like the roles and the overall experience, you want to spend the time to go and make sure the actual like real thing works as expected. And that's where we found that something like a UAT plan can be really helpful. For anyone who's not familiar with that acronym, UAT is user acceptance testing. I think it probably gets called a lot of different things in a lot of different places. But the general idea is that's a single document that it's almost like a user story doc, right? That like contains all of the things each admin role should be able to do and everything that would go into testing this site. So, for us, that often can take the form of upfront, that's a requirements doc that we create as part of the planning process that all of the project stakeholders are on the same page about. And then that requirements doc essentially becomes our UAT plan at the end of the process, which is nice because, then we're not creating wasted docs early on, and we're carrying that knowledge all the way through the process. And then by the time it comes time to test, everybody's on the same page about like the individual tasks that we're testing. And it, you don't end up with, oh, I thought this user could do this, the next user could do this. And oh, I didn't even realize like I was going to have to do this thing. And we just find that it's a really good way to get on the same page. And, last comment I'll make about it is QA and testing is super important. Totally realize like we're all working in the real world with real budgets and real people. I think, similar to build spec and planning, like we don't want to be too prescriptive with this, but we do want to just like drive home the point that like this is a super important part of the process that you want to do your best to not cut out as much as possible.
So, we've done our research, we've made our plan, we know how we're going to approach the admin experience. We've used all the core and contrib modules, made our own custom tweaks. So we're done, right? Like, and we never have to think about our admin experience again. Well, you know what? It's never over. We can consistently learn new things about our site's users. The user team, might learn something new. They can grow their skills. The team could change altogether, and we may just need to adjust to accommodate that. So making changes for that, and then new features are added to core all the time. And so we can always improve the experience. New contrib modules become available all the time. It might fix pain points your admins are experiencing. And you can spend time, building custom solutions for particular features that they're experiencing all the time. And, how do we know what we should be spending our time and energy on? And really what we've found is most successful for us is really talking to those site admins, knowing what they're working on a regular basis. How do they think it can be improved? What can we change? What are they doing day to day that would make their work easier if we just made a change? Maybe we've set up something and they've got 20 clicks to get all the way through to the end. you know, and it's something that they're doing 2 or 3 times a day or weekly. Can we improve that? You know, and sometimes the smallest change can make the world of difference to your site admins when you find out what their day-to-day tasks are. So that's kind of it. Yeah, thanks for participating. Looks like we got some good comments. I know we only got about five minutes left. Nick, I don't know if you had some questions called out that you want to touch on. Otherwise, you know, like Nick mentioned, we'll be in our booth. If anybody else wants to follow up, have questions, we can get way in the weeds about stuff.
Yeah, definitely. And make sure you fill out the survey. I saw Eric just posted something in the chat. It's linked at the top of the chat channel, so it's more easily clickable there. But we've got the link in our deck as well. Like, we love to hear feedback. Like, we really appreciate everybody coming. Like, super awesome to see everyone interacting in the chat. So yeah, let's answer a few questions. I saw one scroll past. I'm going to grab just to make sure I've got everything. But I think like there were a couple of things I had flagged to make comments on. But let's just start with the questions. And I mean, I think the first one is that question I mentioned from Luca that, Aubrey, I don't know if you just want to give kind of the 2-minute summary of how you implement collapsed paragraphs like in ADMINKit and on sites.
Yeah, we just added a quick little JavaScript snippet. Like we mentioned, it is an ADMINKit, so if you want to pull that down and take a look at the code, by all means, go for it. But it's just a quick little JavaScript that's just collapsing and expanding that preview view mode. And I think I saw somebody else mention we definitely recommend using the preview view mode in paragraphs just to give it that smaller view. You can also control all the fields that display. Maybe there's fields that don't make sense to display in your preview view mode, but you do that, and then we just have a little JavaScript snippet that just has a min height on it, and then you click on it, expand it, click on it, and close it. So pretty straightforward on that one.
Nice, awesome, thanks. And then next question that we'll tackle real quick is from Mark. The question is, who on the project team decides on the naming convention for fields and components? And for us, the way we staff a project is like, we don't really have a lot of projects that it's just a single developer working on it. If it was, it would be that person, because you know, like in our case, our development team are the people at the company who know Drupal. And I think it's really important that it is someone who's familiar with Drupal and kind of like how that architecture works. And more specifically, when we staff projects, we'll put at least one lead developer on a project, depending on the scope, sometimes 2, where we'd have like a front-end lead and a back-end lead. But it's going to be that lead developer who is part of discovery sessions and is like on the front lines with the client early, who's doing that stuff, so they can kind of have a good reference for the overall context of, you know, who's using the site and how often they're using it and what the volume of people is going to look like. I don't know if there's anything you'd add to that, Aubrey.
Nope, I think that's kind of it, you know, and I think the other piece, you know, is really making sure you talk to the clients and get their vernacular. Maybe they call it something different, and being very specific about that.
Yeah, and actually Gurwinder made a great point in the chat. He's one of the senior devs on our team here at Elevated Third too, that he often works really closely with the designer on the project as well. And I know, Aubrey, I know you do too, and our designers are doing a lot with, I think, what's Envision's tools at the DSM, where they're defining like component systems and stuff. So that's always super important. And then Jordan asked, have you ever used block list override? I have not. Do you know?
I don't think we have either. I think we've talked about it, and I think you mentioned the blacklist one as well.
Looks like it was formerly blacklist.
Oh, okay. That's what I've heard
cool
it
to
as.
see they renamed it. That's nice.
Yeah. Yeah, but we'll have to give that one a try. We're always looking for new things that help improve the experience.
Awesome. All right. And let's see, one more from Nathan. The question is, do you have recommendations for improving admin UX for enterprise systems? Our customers have a wide variety of needs, which can add a lot of complexity to our structured content. I mean, this is a great question. It's tough to know where to start with this one, and one that maybe warrants a little more discussion than like the 1 minute or so that we have left. But I mean, I think like generally, you know, the implementation tools Aubrey talked about are good things that like you don't have to use from square one, right? I mean, like you can find places where you're having like really specific problems and see if there's like custom work or contrib work or even core work that could help with that problem. And I mean, I think like the best recommendation, kind of like along those same lines, is if you can talk to your users, you know, like do some focus groups, do some surveys. You know, I mean, we haven't done a lot of this, but we've kind of toyed with the idea of using something like Hotjar to do screen recordings of admin users, which, you know, obviously there's a lot of like privacy concerns and stuff tied up in that. So it depends a little bit on your situation. But I mean, I think like the point there is like, you know, when you've got an enterprise system, like in my mind, that applies, like it's big and has a lot of dependencies and there's a lot of things happening, and maybe a lot of like testing to do or something like that. So, I mean, I think it's like, you know, focus on prioritizing and focus on the areas that are, you know, maybe affecting revenue the most or creating the most pain for users, and like start with those, and just know that, you know, with a toolbox like the one we've talked through, it doesn't have to be like a fresh site build. I think like we talk about it in that context because that's our day-to-day. But, you know, it can be like we're upgrading older sites we've built to Claro. We're adding in a lot of these tools and just, you know, continuing on.
I mean, we've even done user interviews for site admins. You know, we've tried to make that a priority on cases when the teams really need a really good admin experience.
All right, awesome. Well, yeah, I think we're right at the hour, so I think we'll go ahead and call it. So seriously, thank you everyone so much for stopping by. Like it's really been a pleasure to present here, and I know I've been blown away by DrupalCon Global and everybody here. It's been fantastic. So we'll head over to the Elevated Third booth in the exhibit hall. We'll hang out there. Maybe Aubrey will do some code stuff with ADMINKit. Look for some live code demo. Reviews. Yeah. Live code, collapsible paragraphs again. Yeah. But yeah, we'll be there. So please feel free to stop by, and thank you again. Aubrey, if you have any final thoughts.
Appreciate it. No, enjoyed talking.
Good deal. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great DrupalCon.